Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel, Beagles Games Guitars. Today's video we're going to be talking about expansions. Alright everyone, today talking about expansions. Are they good? Are they bad? Should you buy them? Should you not buy them? Are they for you? Are they for everyone? Well, I have a list right here, and I'm going to go over quite a bit that I think about expansions. I will start off with the good. We're going to do good and bad. So a lot of the good things about expansions is that they add more diversity to a game. You have your base game, and you've played it for quite a bit, and you want to do something new, something different. So the expansion will add like a new piece to the puzzle. So that also gives you a renewed interest in probably an old game that might be sitting on the shelf for quite a while because you've played it so many times. Expansion adds something new. So you're kind of exploring the game all over again. So that one aspect, that one new puzzle just kind of moves the wheels in the brain a little bit differently while you're playing. So those are some good things about expansions. And ultimately, an expansion is supposed to have increased replayability. Maybe something's too static in the base game and they realize that. So hey, let's go ahead and make this more replayable. So every time you set it up, it can be a little bit different. Now I'll be getting into the bad things about expansions. I've noticed with a lot of expansions, the first thing that they do is they'll increase the player count. So more players doesn't necessarily mean it's a better game. I kind of feel like if you designed a game with a certain amount of players, then it was meant for that many players. Adding an extra player just kind of changes how the game feels. And generally, bigger groups take longer to play. I tend to like to play games that are between 2 to 4 players. Once you start getting into the 5 and 6 player range, it does take a while to play some games. I have a couple of 6 player games up here, and I've played them at 6 players, and it takes quite a while. And the nature of expansions is it's already sometimes difficult to bring certain games to the table, and when you have an expansion, you already just got this table to the game, game to the table, and you might not even bring it to the table again for a while. So there, you have to teach the game all over again, and then it's just that much harder to bring in an expansion, of course, if everybody forgot. Now, if it's a current game that you play over and over again with the same group, and you play it a lot and everybody knows the rules, I can understand adding an expansion, but usually it's just harder to teach. Some expansions I feel like take away from the core game itself, and I have a few examples, mainly one game in particular that does that. But sometimes the game was meant to be this. When you add the expansion, it's just changing what the original intention or the mechanics of the game was. If an expansion is available the moment that the base game is available, that's usually a red flag for me saying, hey, why wasn't this included in the base game? Why do I have to pay for an additional expansion? That's just adding more of the same. Why didn't we just go ahead and include this in the base game? I would understand if like a year or so down the road, you would release an expansion that is more of the same because that's what people wanted. And I have some examples for that as well. And there's kind of a debate between should you keep all these expansion boxes or should you go and collect all these big boxes, guilty as charged, and start stuffing everything in these big boxes, and it kind of becomes a money pit where you're buying all these little expansions just to play this game that you might not even bring to the table all the time. So there's kind of this running conundrum of you just spending a lot of money for a bunch of cardboard, which hey, that's what this hobby is, right? So I think the bad segment ended up being a little bit longer than the good, so that might be kind of an overall theme of how I feel about expansions. So now that I have a general overview of good and bad, I'm going to give you a list of games that I don't regret buying, and then a list of games that I do regret buying. So we're going to start with games that I regretted buying expansions for. The first game on the list of expansions I regret buying is actually 2 expansions for 1 game, and that is Everdell, and you're going to be surprised, it is the Spirecrest and the Belfair expansions. So the reason I don't like these expansions, and I'll kind of list them out individually. Spirecrest, I feel like it takes away from the original intention of the game, where you are deploying your workers and playing your cards to build a tableau. I feel like that the Spirecrest board focused on these big meeple critters that you would put your other meeple on top of, and it would have a special power, which is cool. But the bottom board, you started putting your resources into buying those cards, and then there was this adventure track where you would dump even more of your resources on just trying to explore these little map tiles. And I felt like that really hurt the original tableau building aspect of the game. I've played it a couple times at 2-player counts. I will admit that I haven't played it at 3 or 4, so I don't know how it would work at a higher player count. And that brings in question Belfair. It adds a 5th and a 6th player. I typically don't enjoy games that go over 4 players because it just takes longer. More people are there, so it's just harder to get a bigger group that wants to play an in-depth game. And Everdell's not a super in-depth game, but it is beyond a gateway game, so there is a little bit of a rules overhead and an understanding of how tableau building works. I also felt like that Spirecrest had a negative impact on the game. Those weather cards would always make something a little bit more difficult to get done, and I didn't find that as a challenge. I found that as like something that just hurt me, because then I wasn't able to get this engine built that I would normally have been able to in the base game. So there was always this frustration where it forced you to use the expansion of getting the big meeple critters. So you, in a way, saved your resources. I could see how it focused on the bottom board, but I think it focused so much it took away from the base game. And for Belfair, those player powers, I couldn't cope with the fact that you lose a worker whenever you go into spring, and also at a 5 and 6 player count. I couldn't accept that. I wanted my worker, not my player powers. So that was something that I just couldn't settle for. The reason I got them, they're on Kickstarter, and you have this fear of missing out, which is another debate about expansions, and I was worried that I wasn't going to be able to get the collector's edition anywhere outside of that. And to be honest, there's really not that much different between the collector's and the retail version. So that is my first set of expansions that I regret buying: Everdell, Spirecrest, and Belfair. This next expansion that I regret buying is actually one of my favorite games. It has made it to the channel as a 2-player game, and it was a very, very terrible video quality. I've been wanting to bring it back, but the expansion in question is Alien Invasion for On Mars. And the reason I regret buying this, not because I didn't want it. I want to play the On Mars Alien expansion. But if you know Vito Lacerda and how he designs games, they are extremely in-depth and extremely heavy. And it is difficult to teach those games, let alone retain how to play those games after you teach it to a group and they come back a month or 2 later and they play the game again. The last thing you want to do is throw in an expansion that adds different rules and even asymmetrical powers. My wife does not like this game as much as I do, so it doesn't get to the table that often. And this is definitely a game that you have to reteach over and over again, because there's so many little details of all of his games to where you'll forget them. But I really want to play the expansion module where there's actually an alien group. And unfortunately, to do that, you have to have 3 players, which that 3rd player would have to learn how to play normally, or one player plays as 2 people and the other person plays as the aliens. So that one person that plays 2 humans would have a lot on his table, literally, in order to maneuver and calculate, whereas the one person who's playing the aliens has to learn a whole new way to play the game, which would be refreshing for me, but I would need a group that already knows how to play this game. So that is my second expansion I regret buying: On Mars Alien Invasion. The third expansion that I regret buying is actually here behind me. It is the Scythe, the Wind Gambit. I do not like using the ships. I think that the ships are actually rather useless, and you shuffle and you randomly get the powers that the ships are going to do throughout the game, and I have just had a difficult time conceptualizing how to implement that into a strategy that is already super efficient. I feel like it kind of took away from the original intention of the game as this efficiency puzzle, where it kind of circumnavigated the rivers, which was kind of cool, but I didn't really see a purpose of picking up the resources and moving them because you hardly ever fought for resources in the first place. The powers for the ships just didn't seem beneficial, and I actually liked how the game ends, where the moment the 6 star is out, boom, you're done. There are cool in-game scenarios like the factory exploding, or you only have 20 turns. It doesn't matter if you get 6 stars. But this is also one where I would need a regular group to play this enough to where they could retain how to play the original game and then throw the wind gambit at them. But I just can't make myself use those ships. Even though they're cool, they're really big ships that stand up, and it adds this huge table presence to the game. But I just don't like them for some reason. So that is my third game that I regret buying an expansion for, Scythe, the Wind Gambit. Okay, another expansion that I regret buying is the Root Clockwork expansion. So I really do like Root, and this isn't necessarily against Root, it's against player groups, because Root is a very difficult game to teach because every group follows general rules, but they play very differently in terms of movement and building and their order of actions. So I'd have to have 4 or 5 people who already know how to play the game. There's kind of a familiar theme with all these, in order for me to try and throw in a random robot. So I'm normally a solo player. As you've seen on my channel, I show off a lot of solo games. And after I bought this, I found a forum where somebody has made these free versions, and they even have printable mats, where I just went and bought cardstock and printed these out. And you have to use player pieces, but essentially that came with the base game. So there's a better version of the Clockwork expansion that is free that I have. So there was honestly no need for me to buy it because it was out there. So this one was almost legitimately just a waste of money because there's a free version. So Root, the Clockwork expansion, I regret buying. Another expansion that I regret buying, I'm going to hit my big boy right here, this long big row, and we're going to stop, boom, right there. Caverna, the Forgotten Folk. So this is another game that is guilty of not getting to the table as often as I would like, because I like other Uwe Rosenberg games better than Caverna. Caverna kind of set the ground for a lot of other games like Fields of Arle and Feast for Odin, and I just find it difficult to bring the game back to the table, let alone bringing an expansion to it, which brings asymmetrical powers. So each player would have to know how to play the game and then remember how to play an asymmetrical power. So there's really not much to this one. It's just the fact that I bought it kind of because I had a foam core insert that came with the Forgotten Folk insert. So hey, why not? And that is a game that I regret buying an expansion for, Caverna, the Forgotten Folk. Another game that I regret buying an expansion for is this boy right here, Between Two Castles of Mad King Ludwig. This is a game that has not made it to the table at a 2+ player count. I've played it solo a couple of times. I'm not a big fan of the solo game because it's a bunch of rule check, tie-breaking stuff, and I'd rather flip a card and it tells you what to do rather than you making the decision through a set of tiebreakers. So I'm not very interested in that solo version. And the Secrets and Soirees expansion adds an 8th player, and I don't think I will ever play this game at 7 players, let alone 8 players, because yet again, that's a big group and it'll take a long time to play. Even though this game is a simultaneous action-taking game where you're working with a left partner and a right partner to build 2 castles, that's just a lot of people all talking all around a table. I can't think of a table that would honestly be big enough. I guess a good-sized dinner table would work, but I bought it because I really like Stonemaier games and I support him and what he has done, and I love all his other games, so it just ended up in my collection. FOMO. So that is a game I regret buying an expansion for. We have a couple more expansions, and then we'll flip over to the ones that I don't regret buying. But for now, I regret buying the Cities and Knights expansion for Catan. So Catan is the game that got me into modern day board gaming. Right after that was Agricola, but for Catan, it is very heavily luck based with the dice roll. You roll the dice and you get the resource if you have a settlement or a city next to it. So they expanded on that idea by having even bigger cities, and you have knights that you can use the wheat to activate them to fight the barbarians whenever they show up. And Catan is just an entry-level game, and I felt like they kind of pasted this heavier theme over an entry-level theme, and it kind of is confusing to my brain in a way. Most of the time when I play Catan, I'm wanting to play with people who don't play board games. If I want to play games with people who do enjoy board games, then I'll go with heavier games. I don't want to have a heavy expansion pasted on a lighter game. It's kind of hard to explain, but that's how I feel. The Seafarers expansion is, I don't regret buying that, I'll say that, because it just expands on what Catan already was. It just adds ships and islands, and that's about it. You can kind of ignore the crazy scenarios and just play like a 4 islands game, and my family picked up really quickly on that. So Cities and Knights is just a little too heavy on top of a base game. So that is an expansion I regret buying. And the last game on this list of expansions I regret buying is up here, Tzolk'in, the Tribes and Prophecies expansion. So to be completely honest, I bought it because I wanted the 5th player color, orange. Orange is my favorite color. I'm one of those that typically tries to play as the same color, and whenever that wasn't one that I could play in the base game, immediately I looked for the 5th player expansion, Tribes and Prophecies. It does add the cool Prophecies tile, or the board, where each phase of the game you're going to lose points or get points depending on what you do. And then the Tribes' asymmetrical powers are really cool. Me and my wife do enjoy playing Tzolk'in, but we typically will just play the base game because I kind of felt like the Tribes and Prophecies got away from what the game was originally intending to do. Plus, the fast, quick actions felt kind of like a band-aid for a 5th player. So I've played it at 3 and 4 players. This game really shines at 4 players. I could see how there's a big issue with 5 players because the wheels would get very crowded and the quick actions are a necessity, but it almost seemed like they needed to add another wheel entirely instead of just quick actions. So that's the last expansion as of right now that I regret buying. Okay, expansions I don't regret buying. I think the list is actually a little bit shorter than the list of games I regret buying expansions for, but at the end of the video I'll go over my feelings about what I think about expansions. So let's get started on the ones that I don't regret buying. I will start this list off with the same game that I started the list of regret buying expansions for, and that is actually Everdell, the Pearlbrook expansion, right there. So I felt like Pearlbrook expanded on the base game in a good way. So it actually added more cards to the deck. So it didn't take away from the tableau building because it gave you more to actually build with. And those cards are actually specific to the new board that was on the left side. So you would do your normal actions out here on the base board, and then at any time, instead of taking these normal actions, you could send, I think your Frog Ambassador is what it's called, off to the left side of the board. And I actually liked the element of like surprise and chance, where you don't know what's under that card until you're there, and then you flip it, and if you have the resources to get it, then you can get it. What's kind of cool about Pearlbrook is I feel like you can ignore a majority of Pearlbrook and still play a pretty good game. You can do a little bit of that left board and then kind of go for the first or second special events, which are now different buildings, instead of those, I forgot what they're called, like City Monument and Grand Tour. Now you have these other buildings that are out there worth 10, 15, 20, 25 points. I just really like the Pearlbrook. I felt like it didn't take away from the core game of Tableau building, because it added those Pearlbrook specific cards, which even had action spaces for the Frog Ambassador to go on to, which I thought was cool. So, regretted buying some, didn't regret buying the other for Everdell. The next expansion that I don't regret buying is actually two of them, and I've managed to stuff them in the base box. That is the Arts and Architecture and the Plans and Ploys expansion for Tapestry. Tapestry is my favorite Stonemaier game. Stonemaier Games game, I guess you could technically say it correct. The reason I like it is that it adds more of the same, which I know people complain about when an expansion adds more of the same, but it wasn't available the day it was released, so I didn't feel like it was a money grab. I felt like what he did as a game creator was listen to what everybody wanted in a game and then gave them that. So Plans and Ploys adds more civilizations, more tapestry cards, and then like another way to play solo. It also added these cool landmark cards where at the beginning you get to choose a landmark card, and at the end of a turn, if you meet that criteria, you get a landmark that only you can get and nobody else. The Arts and Architecture actually added an entire new track, that 5th Arts track, and I felt like that really opened the game up, because if somebody else was just shooting straight down a track and it was kind of what you needed, you can focus on this arts track. It's kind of a jack of all trades where you'll get a little bit of everything going down there. And I actually like running and gunning down the arts track because I end up winning when I do. So more of the same is not a bad thing, especially when the creator of the game listens to what the fans and the players are saying about the game and actually giving you something that you want instead of just assuming what you want and releasing it at the same time. Because I felt like if you release an expansion at the same time as the base game, you should have just included it in the base game. That releasing them at the same time feels like they are the base game. So it's actually two expansions that I don't regret buying for Tapestry. I'll keep this next entry shorter than the other ones, but it is Viticulture, the Tuscany Essential Edition. I like it mainly because of that new board. I haven't played any of the modular expansions, but that new board expands on the base idea. It doesn't change necessarily how the game was played. You have to plan a little bit differently, but now it seems to make more sense with the seasons. And whenever you're playing solo, it feels more, I guess, realistic, like you're playing against a real player. And it's just that season board is what makes Viticulture even better with the expansion. So I do not regret buying Tuscany. Another expansion I don't regret buying is actually top shelf up here, and that is Dune Imperium, The Rise of Ix. So I actually set out to play this game X number of times until I decided to get the expansion, because this is actually one that I heard that when you get the expansion, it completes the game and makes it actually better than what it was. So I wanted to play, I think we played 7 games almost in a row without expansions, me and my wife, and we noticed that every single game that we played, the same thing seemed to happen, where you had an overwhelming amount of Solari, which is the currency in the game. I would have a lot, and I felt like after you got your council seat, you paid for your extra character, that Solari became pretty useless in the game after you got all the way up on one of the factions. And the Rise of Ix board kind of made Spice and Solari a little more of a revolving door, to where you would get some and you could spend some, get some and spend some. It replaced that top right section of the board that I thought was really useless, the exchange of Spice and Solari. I never went there in the base game. Maybe that was why I had so much Solaris, because I never went up there. Now Solari had a purpose instead of just sitting there next to my board. The Rise of Ix also added more characters to play from, more conflict cards, and then more just regular cards. So it gave you more of the same, which is always good in my opinion, an expansion that adds more of the same. But it also added the Dreadnought unit, which I think is kind of like a little trump unit that you bring out there that'll just make you that much better than everyone else. And he doesn't go away all the time. So that's a unit that is always out there and ready to deploy, and it just adds more tension to the conflicts, I felt like. So that is an expansion I do not regret buying at all. Another big expansion that I do not regret buying is right here, Feast for Odin, the Norwegians expansion. I originally bought Feast for Odin in my Uwe Rosenberg craze, just trying to collect as many as I could, and it's a table hog. It's a big boy. Even playing solo, there's a lot going on. For 1 to 4 players, it was almost the same board every single time, and it wasn't scaled down. So it was almost too open, and I felt like the game just kind of, even though it has a lot, I felt like it needed even more. But having the player board actually be scalable to player count really seemed to make the game shine. And then the new animals, which I think are the horses and the pigs. So the pigs is one of the few tiles that flip over and actually not be an animal. So you could actually flip a pig into a non-animal item and then put it in your storage areas, which I thought was really cool. And also on the new board, it had a 5th action row where you could take that row with 1 or 2 workers, but it would be your last action of that entire round. So there was kind of this increased tension on who was going to go there first. And when you play solo, you block yourself, potentially. And it's just more things you had to think about, which I enjoyed, that 5th action row a lot. I felt like that really made the game just that much better than the base game. So Feast for Odin, Norwegians expansion, I don't regret buying you. Let's stick with my boy Uwe Rosenberg. So way down here in the corner, Fields of Arle, my favorite Uwe Rosenberg game, has an expansion, the Tea and Trade expansion. And I like it exactly for that, Tea and Trade. They have a new resource that's called Tea. There's regular tea and East Frisian tea, which lets you take actions at a slightly more powerful way. Like you increase how your tools are, the number of your tools, more powerful basically. And there's also a couple of other cool mechanics that when I'm playing with somebody else, I tend to use them more than the other people, which are the ditches, which lets you drain your peat bogs without actually having to go to an action that specifically drains peat bogs and like that's it. So when you build ditches, you can actually build them, drain the peat bogs, and you can have sheep breed within those dehydrated areas around the ditches. So it's kind of like a 3-way bonus on doing the ditches action. So I can do a few things at once. I don't really use the ships area that much, but it is cool to have a couple of ships built to where if you don't use them, you'll actually get food. So they're kind of like a food source every round. I've always wanted to play this game with 3 players, and I really like how the 3-player setup is, where it's not necessarily going to be a longer game because they actually make it have less rounds and everybody starts with a little bit more, like a building, increased tools, and a cart. So you kind of have like a buffer, a bonus setup, kind of like Prelude by Terraforming Mars, where you get extra stuff that expedite the round and just make the game play faster. So Fields of Arle, Tea and Trade, I don't regret buying you either. And let's finish this list off with the Stonemaier Games game, Euphoria, The Ignorance is Bliss. So I bought this a couple of years ago and was sad whenever it didn't have a solo mode, because Stonemaier Games is really good about having an automa in every single game that they've made. And then I realized that there was an expansion that solved this remedy. It had an expansion or a solo mode built into it. I play at a 2-player count on Euphoria, and the tunnels for the miners are really far away whenever you're playing with 2 players on the base game. I actually bought the new board that you put the miners in certain locations, and that makes them get to their destinations a little bit quicker. There's also the card bazaar, which I think really helps expedite the artifacts, to where if you really want that artifact, you can pay a resource to get it, or there's this free one here. So if I get the free one, they're all going to slide down conveyor belt style, and you can see what's coming. I felt like in the base game, you had no idea what was coming. So it was always just kind of a risk drawing the cards, but now that you can see them, there they are. There's more planning involved instead of just luck. Also, you can deploy 2 workers or 3 workers as long as they have the same number value, but you have to pay morale or pay some food. Morale to take them out there. I felt like that was a nice balance. And then the buildings, some of those buildings I felt like you can never get out of. It was like, cannot put a star on this building or any other buildings until a star is on this building. So you're really, like, it was a huge crutch. Some of those buildings just really made you focus on getting a star on it, and you couldn't do anything else. The newer buildings were a lot more friendly, I guess that's what I should say. And then the factionless cards were really cool, to where they had a really big power, but you didn't get extra resources. So that was just another choice at the beginning of the game that you had to choose from on those 4 cards that are dealt out to you. Which one do I want to pick? Factionless has a huge power, but I don't get extra resources. And then factionless always has to be the first card that is up. Your face down card has to be with a faction. So you kind of show your colors with the factionless in the beginning, but it was something that I enjoyed. So my main takeaways for expansions is that they're good and they're bad. Expansions offer replayability, new elements, and then just an exciting new way to play a game. But the drawbacks to them is that it's more money that you're investing into this hobby. It's harder to bring to the table, especially if you don't bring it to the table often enough anyway. And then sometimes they're just honestly cash grabs. I'm looking at you, Ankh, where you have just huge pile of expansions that are just available at day 1 on Kickstarter. I think Bloodborne did this, Skyrim did this, and I think even Eldritch Horror has just this massive collection of expansions. I haven't fallen victim for the miniatures, where all you're doing is buying miniatures that just add more presence to the table. I want substance behind those. So I feel like a lot of expansions can potentially be cash grabs, especially if they're available on the day that the base game is available. I like seeing creators release a game, let it go out there, let them play it, see the feedback that is coming from the game, and then they can make an expansion based on what people are saying about it. Because if you already have an expansion, you should have just included that in the base game, because why not? So don't give in to the Kickstarter FOMOs like Skyrim and Ankh and Bloodborne, where if you don't buy it now, you're never going to get it, and it's going to be very expensive on the second-hand market. And then you also have to think, is this game good for my group? If it is, then you can think about bringing an expansion to the table. Whereas if you're not going to bring the game to the table and it's mainly something you're going to play, you really have to think, am I going to play this solo? Does this add anything new to the solo? Am I going to enjoy it? So expansions are good and bad, and I think you should approach them with caution, research them, see if they're worth even buying, and if your particular game group would even want to play an expansion. They might just be happy with the base game and they don't want anything new. Some people don't like new. They just want to play the same thing over and over. So you just have to cater it to what is around you. Anyways, that is what I think about expansions. I hope you enjoyed watching, and I will see you next time.